Today we'll be reading some actual history from this book, Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians by Fanny Kelly. This book was published back in 1871. So today is episode 8 in my series on the attack on Fanny Kelly's wagon train. In the last episode, Sarah Larimer, the other woman captured, successfully escaped with her son. And in this episode, we'll hear about what happened to Fanny as she remained a prisoner with the Sioux Indians. The name given to Powder River by the Indians is Chahali-Wakapola. It crosses the country east of the Bighorn Mountains, and from its banks can be seen the snow-capped Cloud Peak rising grandly from its surrounding hills. Between these ranges that culminate in the queenly, shining crowned height that takes its name from the clouds it seems to pierce, are fertile valleys in which game abounds, and delicious wild fruits in great variety, some of which cannot be surpassed by cultivated orchard products in the richness and flavor they possess, although they ripen in the neighborhood of everlasting snow. In these valleys, the country seems to roll in gentle slopes, presenting to the eye many elements of loveliness and future value. Powder River, which is a muddy stream, comes from the southern side of the Bighorn Mountains and takes a southwestern course, and is therefore not a part of the bright channel that combines to feed the Missouri River from the Bighorn Range. This range of the Rocky Mountains possesses two distinct marked features. First, there is a central or backbone range which culminates in perpetual snow, where Cloud Peak grandly rises as the chief of all its proud summits. Falling off gradually towards the southern valley, there are similar ranges of the Wind River Mountains beyond. Between these ranges, and in varying breadth from 12 to 25 miles, are fine hunting grounds, abounding in noble orchards of wild fruit of various kinds, and grapes as well as game of the choicest kind for the huntsman. Notwithstanding its vicinity to snow, there are gentle slopes which present features of peculiar loveliness. Several miles northwest and following the sweep of the higher mountain range, and 6 to 8 miles outside its general base, a new country opens. Sagebrush and cactus, which for nearly 200 miles have so largely monopolized the soil, rapidly disappear. The change, though sudden, is very beautiful. One narrow divide only is crossed, and the transition about 1 day's ride from the Powder River. The limpid, transparent, and noisy waters of Deer Fork are reached, and the horses have difficulty in breasting the swift current. The river is so clear that every pebble and fish is seen distinctly on the bottom, and the water so cool that ice in midsummer is no object of desire. The scenes of natural beauty and the charms that have endeared this country to the Indian will in the future lure the emigrant seeking a home in this new and undeveloped land. This clear creek is a genuine outflow from the Bighorn Mountains, and is a type of many others, no less pure and valuable, derived from melting snow and from innumerable springs in the mountains. Rock Creek comes next, with far less pretensions but is similar in character. A day's ride to the northward brings the traveler to Crazy Woman's Fork. This ever-flowing stream receives its yellow hue from the Powder River waters, of which it is a branch. The country is scarred by countless trails of buffalo, so that what is often called the Indian Trail is merely the hoofprint of these animals. Leaving Powder River, we pass through large pine forests and through valleys rich with beautiful grasses, with limpid springs and seemingly eternal verdure. I continue to drop papers by the way, hoping they might lead to my discovery, which would have proved fatal had anyone attempted a rescue, as the Indians prefer to kill their captives rather than be forced to give them up. It was the 5th night of my sojourn with the Indians that I found myself under the weeping willows of Clear Creek. The men, weary with travel and glad to find so good a camping ground, lay down to sleep, leaving a sufficient guard over their captive and at the outposts. Their journey hither had been a perilous one to me, unused as I was to the rocky paths between narrow gorges and over masses of broken stone, which their Indian ponies climbed with readiness and ease. I was led to remark the difference between these ponies and American horses, who could only struggle to find their foothold over such craggy ground, while the ponies led the way, picking their steps up almost perpendicular steeps with burdens on their backs. Their travel after the rest at Clear Creek partook of the difficult nature of the mountain passes, and was wearisome in the extreme, and the duties imposed upon me made life almost too burdensome to be borne. I was always glad of a respite at the camping ground. On the 6th night I lay on a rock under the shade of some bushes, meditating on the possibility of escape. The way was far beyond my reckoning, and the woods where they now were might be infested with wild beasts, but the prospect of getting away and being free from the Indians closed my eyes to the terrors of starvation and ravenous animals. Softly I rose and attempted to steal toward some growing timber, but the watchful chief did not risk his prey so carelessly. His keen eye was on me, and his iron hand grasped my wrist and drew me back. Throwing me fiercely on the ground, he hissed a threat through his clenched teeth, which I momentarily expected him to put into execution as I lay trembling at his feet. I felt from this time that my captivity was for life, and a dull despair took possession of me. Sleep, that balm for happier souls, brought only horrid dreams, in which a dreadful future pictured itself. And then the voices of my husband and child seemed calling me to their side, alas, in vain, for when I awoke it was to find myself in the grass of the Indian camping ground, watched over by the relentless guard, and shut out from hope of home or civilized life. My feet were covered with a pair of good shoes, and the chief's brother-in-law gave me a pair of stockings from his stores, which I gladly accepted, never for a moment suspecting that, in doing thus, I was outraging a custom of the people among whom I was. The chief saw the gift and made no remark at the time, but soon after he shot one of his brother-in-law's horses, which he objected to in a decided manner, and a quarrel ensued. Realizing that I was the cause of the disagreement, I tremblingly watched the contest, unable to conciliate either combatant and dreading the wrath of both. The chief would brook no interference, nor would he offer any reparation for the wrong he had inflicted. His brother-in-law, enraged at his arrogance, drew his bow and aimed his arrow at my heart, determined to have satisfaction for the loss of his horse. I could only cry to God for mercy and prepare to meet the death which had long hung over my head, when a young Blackfoot, whose name was Jumping Bear, saved me from the approaching doom by dexterously snatching the bow from the Indian and hurling it to the earth. He was named Jumping Bear from the almost miraculous dexterity of some of his feats. This circumstance and the Indian mentioned were, in my judgment, instruments in the hand of Providence. His activity in the attack on our train and the energy he displayed in killing and pillaging on that occasion, notwithstanding his efforts to make me believe the contrary, forbade me to think that there was any sympathy in his interference in my behalf. The Indian submitted to his intervention so far that he did not draw his bow again, and my suspense was relieved for the time by the gift of a horse from the chief to his brother-in-law, which calmed the fury of the wronged Indian. It happened that the animal thus given as a peace offering was the pack horse that pulled so uncomfortably against the leading rein, and thus in the end I gained by the ordeal through which I had passed, in being relieved of a most unmanageable task. From the first I was deprived of every ameliorating comfort that might have rendered my existence bearable. No tent was spread for me, no rug or coverlet offered me to lie on. The hard earth, sparsely spread with grass, furnished me a couch, and apprehension and regret deprived me of the rest my toilsome life demanded. They offered me no food, and at first I did not dare to ask for it. This was partly owing to the absence of all natural appetite, an intense weakness and craving constantly for drink being the only signs of the prolonged fast that annoyed me. The utter hopelessness of my isolation wore on me, driving me almost to madness, and visions of husband and child haunted my brain. Sometimes they were full of hope and tauntingly happy. At others I saw them dying or dead, but always beyond my reach, and separated by the impassable barrier of my probably lifelong captivity. In my weakened condition, the horrors of the stake, to which I felt myself borne daily nearer as they progressed on their homeward route, appeared like a horrid phantom. It had been threatened me since my first effort to escape, and I was led to believe such a punishment was the inevitable consequence of my attempt. The terrible heat of the days continued, and the road they took was singularly barren of water. The Indians, after drinking plentifully before starting, carry little sticks in their mouth, which they chew constantly, thus creating saliva, and preventing the parching sensation I endured from the want of this knowledge. The seventh night they entered a singular canyon, apparently well known to them, as they found horses there which evidently had been left on a former visit. I cannot but wonder at the sagacity and patience of these Indian ponies, which were content to wait their master's coming, and browse about on the sparse herbage and meager grass. The Indians had killed an antelope that day, and a piece of raw flesh was allotted me for a meal. They had then traveled in a circuitous route for miles to reach the mouth of this canyon, and entered it just after sundown. Its gloomy shade was a great relief after the heat of the sun, and it filled my sensitive mind with awe. The sun never seemed to penetrate its depths, and the damp air rose around me like the breath of a dungeon. Downward they went as if descending into the bowels of the earth, and the sloping floor they trod was covered with red sand for perhaps the space of half a mile. Then they struck a rocky pavement, the perpendicular walls of which were of earth, but as they made another turning and entered a large space, they seemed to change to stone with projecting arches and overhanging cornices. The high walls rose above the base so as to nearly meet the overhead, and with their innumerable juttings and irregularities had the appearance of carved columns supporting a mighty ruin. Occasionally a faint ray of the fading light struggled with the gloom, into which they plunged deeper and deeper, and then their horses' cautious feet would turn the bones of antelope or deer, drawn thither by the lurking wolf to feed the young in their lair. I was startled with dread at the sight, fearing that they might be human bones, with which mine would soon be mingled. The increasing darkness had made it necessary for the Indians to carry torches, which they did, lighting up the grotesque grandeur of earth and rock through which they passed by the weird glare of their waving brands. Arriving at the spot they selected as a camping ground, they made fires, whose fantastic gleams danced upon the rocky walls, and added a magic splendor to their wondrous tracery. The ghostly grandeur of these unfrequented shades cannot be described, but their effect is marvelous. They seem to shadow forth the outline of carving and sculpture, and in the uncertain firelight have all the effect of some old-time temple, whose art and glory will live forever, even when its classic stones are dust. Here I found water for my parched lips, which was more grateful to my weary senses than any natural phenomenon, and sinking on a moss-grown rock near the trickling rill that sank away in the sand beyond, I found slumber in that strange, fantastic solitude. I was aroused by a whistling sound, and gathering myself up, looked fearfully around me. 2 flaming eyes seemed to pierce the darkness like a sword. I shuddered and held my breath, and a long, lithe serpent wound past me, trailing its shining link through the damp sand and moving slowly out of sight among the dripping vines. After that I slept no more, and when I saw the struggling light of day pierce the rocky opening above, I gladly hailed the safety of the sunshine, even though it brought sorrow, distress, and toil. When we rose in the morning, they left the canyon by the path they had entered, as it seemed to have no other outlets, and then pursued their way. On the 20th of July, we had nearly reached the Indian village when we camped for the night, as usual, when such a locality could be gained, on the bank of a stream of good water. Here was a stream of sparkling, rippling water, fresh from the melting snow of the mountain. It was a warm, still night. Soon the sky began to darken strangely, and great ragged masses of clouds hung low over the surrounding hills. The air grew heavy, relieved occasionally by a deep gust of wind, that died away to be succeeded by an ominous calm. Then a low, muttering thunder jarred painfully on the ear. My shattered nerves recoiled at the prospect of the coming storm. From a child I had been timid of lightning, and now its forked gleam filled me with dismay and my unsheltered helplessness. The Indians, seeing the approaching tempest, prepared for it by collecting and fastening their horses, and covering their firearms and ammunition, and then lying flat on the earth themselves. I crouched too, but could not escape the terrible glare of the lightning, and the roar of the awful thunder grew deafening. On came the storm with startling velocity, and the dread artillery of heaven boomed overhead, followed closely by blinding flashes of light, and the velocity of the whirlwind seemed to arise in its might to add desolation to the terrible scene. When the vivid gleams lit up the air, enormous trees could be seen bending under the fierceness of the blast, and great white sheets of water burst out of the clouds. Every element in nature united in terrific warfare, and the security of earth seemed denied to me while I clung to its flooded bosom, and blinded by lightning and shocked by the incessant roaring of the thunder and the wild ravaging of the ungovernable winds, I felt myself but a tossed atom in the great confusion, and I could only cling to God's remembering pity in silent prayer. Huge trees were bent to the earth and broken. Others, snapped off like twigs, were carried through the frenzied air. The rain had already swelled the little creek into a mighty stream that rolled its dark, angry waters with fury, and added its sullen roar to the howlings of the storm. I screamed, but my voice was lost even to myself among the mightier ones of the furious elements. 3 hours, 3 long, never-to-be-forgotten hours did the storm rage thus in fury, and in those hours I thought I lived a lifetime. Then, to my joy, it began to abate, and soon I beheld the twinkling stars through rents in the driving clouds, while the flashing lightning and the roaring thunders, gradually becoming less and less distinct to the eye and ear, told me that the devastating storm was speeding on toward the east. And when, at the dawn of day, the waters were assuaged, the thunder died away, and the lightnings were chained in their cell, the scene was one of indescribable desolation. The wind had gone home. Daylight had cowed him from a raging giant into a meek prisoner, and led him moaning to his cavern in the eastern hills. A strangely solemn calm seemed to take the place of the wild conflict, but the track of destruction was there, and the swollen water and felled trees, the scattered boughs and uprooted saplings, told the story of the havoc of the storm. It was a night of horror to pass through, and I thankfully greeted the returning day, that once more gave me the comfort of light, now almost my only solace, for my position grew more bitter, as the chief's exultation in my capture and abduction increased as we neared the village where their families were, and where I feared my fate would be decided by bloodshed or the fearful stake. On the 21st of July, we left camp early, the day being cool and favorable for traveling. Our route lay over rolling prairie interspersed with extensive tracts of marsh, which, however, we easily avoided crossing. A few miles brought us to a high, broken ridge, stretching nearly in a north and south direction. As we ascended this ridge, we came in sight of a large buffalo herd, quietly feeding upon the bunch or buffalo grass which they prefer to all other kinds. These animals are short-sighted and scent the approach of an enemy before they can see him, and thus in their curiosity they often start to meet him until they approach near enough to ascertain to their satisfaction whether there be danger in a closer acquaintance. In this case, they decided in the affirmative, and when they had only once fairly made us out, lost no time in increasing the distance between us, starting on a slow, clumsy trot which was soon quickened to a gait that generally left most pursuers far in the rear. But the Indians and their horses both are trained buffalo hunters, and soon succeeded in surrounding a number. They ride alongside their victim, and leveling their guns or arrows send their aim shot in the region of the heart. Then they ride off to a safe distance to avoid the desperate lunge which a wounded buffalo seldom fails to make. And shaking his shaggy head, crowned with thorns of most formidable strength, stands at bay with eyes darting, savage and defiant, as he looks at his human foe. Soon the blood begins to spurt from his mouth, and to choke him as it comes. The hunters do not shoot again, but wait patiently until their victim grows weak from loss of blood, and, staggering, falls upon his knees, makes a desperate effort to regain his feet, and get at his slayer. Then, falling once more rolls over on his side, dead. Sometimes these animals number tens of thousands in droves. The Indians often for the mere sport make an onslaught, killing great numbers of them and having a plentiful feast of tatanka, as they call buffalo meat. They use no economy in food. It is always a feast or a famine, and they seem equally able to gorge or fast. Each man selects the part of the animal he has killed that best suits his own taste, and leaves the rest to decay or to be eaten by wolves, thus wasting their own game, and often suffering privation in consequence. They gave me a knife and motioned me to help myself to the feast. I did not accept, thinking then it would never be possible for me to eat uncooked meat. They remained here overnight, starting early next morning. We were now nearing the village where the Indians belonged. Jumping Bear, the young Indian who had shown me so many marks of goodwill, again made his appearance with a sad expression on his face, and that day would ride in silence by my side, which was an act of great condescension on his part, for these men rarely thus equalize themselves with women, but ride in advance. They had traveled nearly 300 miles, and despite my fears, I began to rejoice in the prospect of arriving among women, even though they were Indians, and a dawning hope that I might find pity and companionship with beings of my own sex, however separated their lives and customs might be, took possession of me. Notwithstanding all I had seen and experienced, I remembered much that was gentle and faithful in the character ascribed to the Indian women. Perhaps I ought to be able to find one whose sympathy and companionship could be wrought upon to the extent of aiding me in some way to escape. I became hopeful with the thought, and almost forgot my terror of the threats of my captors in my desire to see the friendly faces of Indian women. The country around was rich and varied. Beautiful birds appeared in the trees, and flowers of variety and fragrance nodded on their stems. Wild fruits were abundant, and I plucked roses and fruit for food, while my Indian companions feasted on raw meat. They did not seem to care for fruit, and urged me to eat meat with them. I refused because of its being raw. A young Indian, guessing the cause of my refusal to eat, procured a kettle, made a fire, cooked some, and then offered it to me. I tried to eat of it to please them, since they had taken the trouble to prepare a special dish, but owing to the filthy manner in which it was prepared, a very small portion satisfied me. We were now nearing a river which, from its locality, must have been the Tongue River, where we found refreshing drink and rested for a short time. The Indians gave me to understand that when we crossed this stream, and a short distance beyond, we would be at their home. Here they paused to dress as to make a gay appearance and imposing entrance into the village. Except when in full dress, an Indian's wearing apparel consists only of a buffalo robe. It is very inconveniently disposed about the person without fastening, and must be held in position with the hands. Ottawa or Silverhorn, the war chief, was arrayed in full costume. He was very old, over 75, partially blind, and a little below the medium height. He was very ferocious and savage-looking, and now, when in costume, looked frightful. His face was red with stripes of black, and around each eye a circlet of bright yellow. His long black hair was divided into 2 braids with a scalp lock on top of the head. His ears held great brass wire rings, full 6 inches in diameter, and chains and bead necklaces were suspended from his neck. Armlets and bracelets of brass, together with a string of bear's claws, completed his jewelry. He wore also leggings of deerskin and a shirt of the same material, beautifully ornamented with beads and fringed with scalp locks that he claimed to have taken from his enemies, both red and white. Over his shoulders hung a great bright-colored quilt that had been taken from our stores. He wore a crown of eagle feathers on his head, also a plume of feathers depending from the back of the crown. His horse, a noble-looking animal, was no less gorgeously arrayed. His ears were pierced like his master's, and his neck was encircled by a wreath of bear's claws, taken from animals that the chief had slain. Some bells and a human scalp hung from his mane, forming together thus arrayed a museum of the trophies of the old chief's prowess on the warpath, and of skill in the chase. When all was arranged, the chief mounted his horse and rode on in triumph toward the village, highly elated over the possession of his white captive, whom he never looked back at or deigned to notice, except to chastise on account of her slowness, which was unavoidable as I rode a jaded horse and could not keep pace. The entire Indian village poured forth to meet us amid song and wild dancing in the most enthusiastic manner, flourishing flags and weapons of war in frenzied joy as we entered the village, which, stretched for miles along the banks of the stream, resembled a vast military encampment, with the wigwams covered with white skins like Sibley tents in shape and size, ranged without regard to order but facing one point of the compass. We penetrated through the irregular settlement for over a mile, accompanied by the enthusiastic escort of men, women, and children. We rode in the center of a double column of Indians and directly in the rear of the chief till we reached the door of his lodge, when several of his wives came out to meet him. He had 6 wives, but the senior one remained in the tent, while a younger wife was absent with the farmer or Grosvenor Indians. Their salutation is very much in the manner of the Mexicans. The women crossed their arms on the chief's breast and smiled. They met me in silence, but with looks of great astonishment. I got down as directed and followed the chief into the great lodge or tent, distinguished from the others by its superior ornaments. It was decorated with brilliantly colored porcupine quills and a terrible fringe of human scalp locks, taken in battle from the Pawnees. On one side was depicted a representation of the Good Spirit, rude in design and daubed with colors. On the other side was portrayed the figure of the spirit of evil in like manner. The Indians believed in these 2 deities and paid their homage to them. The first they consider as entirely benevolent and kind, but the second is full of vile tricks and wicked ways. They fear him and consider it only safe to propitiate him occasionally by obedience to his evil will. This may account for some of their worst ferocities and explain that horrible brutality of nature which they sometimes exhibit. The senior wife, who had remained in the lodge, met her husband with the same salutation as the others had done. I was shown a seat opposite the entrance on a buffalo skin. The chief's spoil was brought in for division by his elderly spouse. As it was spread out before them, the women gathered admiringly around it, and proved their peculiarities of taste. And love of finery had a counterpart in these forest belles, as well defined as if they had been city ladies. Eagerly they watched every new article displayed, grunting their approval until their senior companion seized a piece of cloth, declaring that she meant to retain it all for herself. This occasioned dissatisfaction, which soon ripened to rebellion among them, and they contended for a just distribution of the goods. The elder matron, following her illustrious husband's plan in quelling such outbreaks, caught her knife from her belt, sprang in among them, vowing that she was the oldest and had the right to govern, and threatening to kill everyone if there was the least objection offered to her decrees. I had hoped to find sympathy and pity among these women of the forest, but instead, cowed and trembling, I sat, scarcely daring to breathe. The chief noticed my fear and shrinking posture and smiled. Then he rose and made a speech which had its effect. The women became quiet. Presently an invitation arrived for the chief to go to a feast, and he rose to comply. I followed his departing figure with regretful glances, for terrible as he and his men had been, the women seemed still more formidable, and I feared to be left alone with them, especially with the hot temper and ready knife of the elder squaw. Great crowds of curious Indians came flocking in to stare at me. The women brought their children, some of them whose fair complexion astonished me. I afterward learned that they were the offspring of fort marriages. One fair little boy, who with his mother had just returned from Fort Laramie, came close to me. Finding the squaw could speak a few words in English, I addressed her, and was told, in reply to my questions, that she had been the wife of a captain there, but that his white wife, arriving from the east, his Indian wife, was told to return to her people. She did so, taking her child with her. The little boy was dressed completely in military clothes, even to the stripe on his pantaloons, and was a very bright, attractive child of about 4 years. It was a very sad thought for me to realize that a parent could part with such a child, committing it forever to live in barbarous ignorance and rove the woods among Indians. I saw many other fair-faced little children and heard the sad story from their mothers, and was deeply pained to see their pale, pinched features as they cried for food when there was none to be had. And they are sometimes cruelly treated by the full-blooded and larger children on account of their birth. Now that the question of property was decided between the women of the chief's family, they seemed kindly disposed toward me, and one of them brought me a dish of meat. Many others followed her example, even from the neighboring lodges, and really seemed to pity me, and showed great evidences of compassion, and tried to express their sympathy in signs, because I had been torn from my own people, and compelled to come such a long, fatiguing journey, and examine me all over and over again, and all about my dress, hands, and feet particularly. Then, to their great surprise, they discovered my bruised and almost broken limbs that occurred when I was first taken, also from the fall of the horse the first night of my captivity, and proceeded at once to dress my wounds. I was just beginning to rejoice in the dawning kindness that seemed to soften their faces, when a messenger from the war chief arrived, accompanied by a small party of young warriors who were sent to conduct me to the chief's presence. I did not at first comprehend the summons, and as every fresh announcement only awakened new fears, I dreaded to comply, yet dared not refuse. Seeing my hesitation, the senior wife allowed a little daughter of the chief's, whose name was Yellowbird, to accompany me, and I was then conducted to several feasts at which I was received with kindness, and promised goodwill and protection. It was here that the chief himself first condescended to speak kindly to me, and this in the companionship of the child Yellowbird, who seemed to approach me with a trusting grace and freedom unlike the scared shyness of Indian children generally, inspired hope. The chief here told me that henceforth I could call Yellowbird my own, to take the place of my little girl who had been killed. I did not at once comprehend all of his meaning, still it gave me some hope of security. When at nightfall we returned to the lodge which they told me I must henceforth regard as home, I found the elder women busily pounding a post into the ground, and my fears were at once aroused, being always ready to take alarm, and suggested to me that it betokened some evil. On the contrary, it was simply some household arrangement of her own. For presently putting on a camp kettle, she built a fire, and caused water to boil, and drew a tea, of which she gave me a portion, assuring me that it would cure the tired and weary feeling and secure me a good rest. This proved true. Soon a deep drowsiness began to steal over the weary captive. My bed of furs was shown me. Yellowbird was told to share my couch with me, and from this time on she was my constant attendant. I laid down, and the wife of the chief tenderly removed my moccasins, and I slept sweetly for the first true sleep I had enjoyed in many weary nights. Before my eyes closed in slumber, my heart rose in gratitude unspeakable to God for His great and immeasurable mercy. I readily adapted myself to my new position. The chief's 3 sisters shared the lodge with us. The following day commenced my labors, and the chief's wife seemed to feel a protecting interest in me. The day of the 20th of July was observed by continual feasting in honor of the safe return of the braves. There was a large tent made by putting several together, where all the chiefs, medicine men, and great warriors met for consultation and feasting. I was invited to attend and was given an elevated seat, while the rest of the company all sat upon the ground, and mostly cross-legged, preparatory to the feast being dealt out. In the center of the circle was erected a flagstaff with many scalps, trophies, and ornaments fastened to it. Near the foot of the flagstaff were placed in a row on the ground several large kettles, in which was prepared the feast. Near the kettles on the ground also were a number of wooden bowls in which the meat was to be served out, and in front 2 or 3 women were there placed as waiters, to light the pipes for smoking and also to deal out the food. In these positions things stood, and all sat with thousands climbing and crowding around for a peep at me, as I appeared at the grand feast and council, when at length the chief arose, in a very handsome costume, and addressed the audience, and in his speech he often pointed to me. I could understand but little of his meaning. Several others also made speeches, that all sounded the same to me. I sat trembling with fear at these strange proceedings, fearing that they were deliberating upon a plan of putting me to some cruel death to finish their amusement. It is impossible to describe my feelings on that day, as I sat in the midst of those wild people. Soon a handsome pipe was lit and brought to the chief to smoke. He took it, and after presenting the stem to the north, the south, the east, and the west, and then to the sun that was over his head, he uttered a few words, drew a few whiffs, and then passed it around through the whole group, who all smoked. The smoking was conducted with the strictest adherence to exact and established form, and the feast throughout was conducted in the most positive silence. The lids were raised from the kettles, which were all filled with dog's meat alone, it being well cooked and made into a sort of stew. Each guest had a large wooden bowl placed before him, with a quantity of dog's flesh floating in a profusion of soup or rich gravy, with a large spoon resting in the dish made of buffalo horn. In this most difficult and painful dilemma I sat, witnessing the solemnity. My dish was given me, and the absolute necessity of eating it was painful to contemplate. I tasted it a few times after much urging, and then resigned my dish, which was taken and passed around with others to every part of the group, who all ate heartily. In this way the feast ended, and all retired silently and gradually, until the ground was left to the waiters, who seemed to have charge of it during the whole occasion. The women signified to me that I should feel highly honored by being called to feast with chiefs and great warriors, and seeing the spirit in which it was given, I could not but treat it respectfully, and receive it as a very high and marked compliment. Since I witnessed it on this occasion, I have been honored with numerous entertainments of the kind, all conducted in the same solemn and impressive manner. As far as I could see and understand, I feel authorized to pronounce the dog feast a truly religious ceremony, wherein the superstitious Indian sees fit to sacrifice his faithful companion, to bear testimony to the sacredness of his vows of friendship for the Great Spirit. He always offers up a portion of the meat to his deity, and then puts it on the ground to remind him of the sacrifice and solemnity of the offering. The dog, among all Indian tribes, is more esteemed and more valued than among any part of the civilized world. The Indian has more time to devote to his company, and his untutored mind more nearly assimilates to the nature of his faithful servant. The flesh of these dogs, though apparently relished by the Indians, is undoubtedly inferior to venison and buffalo meat, of which feasts are constantly made, where friends are invited as they are in civilized society to a pleasant and convivial party, from which fact alone it would seem clear that they have some extraordinary motive at all events for feasting on the flesh of that useful and faithful animal, even when, as in the instance I have been describing, their village was well supplied with fresh and dried meat of the buffalo and deer. The dog feast is given, I believe, by all tribes of America, and by them all, I think, this faithful animal, as well as the horse, is sacrificed in several different ways, to appease offended spirits or deities, whom it is considered necessary that they should conciliate in this way, and when done is invariably done by giving the best in the herd or the kennel. That night was spent in dancing. Wild and furious all seemed to me. I was led into the center of the circle and assigned the painful duty of holding above my head human scalps fastened to a little pole. The dance was kept up until near morning, when all repaired to their respective lodges. The 3 kind sisters of the chief were there to convey me to mine. So that's it for this episode. Here, Fanny Kelly survived another close call when the chief's brother-in-law gave her some socks, and the chief then shot one of his horses in jealousy. Fanny also arrived at the Sioux village where she was the guest of honor at a dog feast. So this channel was named Unworthy History because it's a play on my last name, which is Worthy, and because the history covered on this program is deemed unworthy to show on TV. And also because we are unworthy to stand in the shoes of some of the people we talk about on this channel. A viewer's comment also sums up the meaning of this channel's name. The title's unworthy is ironic, as it denotes much past historiography's demotion or suppression of the personal stories, biographies and narratives of personal life events and phases, histories and her stories of thitherto sub-elite people of various races, ethnicities, genders, ages, and other human conditions, even as it reveals such narratives and their subjects to be extraordinarily meritocratically worthy. So in the next episode in this series, we'll see what happens next to Fanny as she is a captive in this Sioux village. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.